I am Abigail Vance, 39 years old. My 12-year-old son Noah and I sat at the center table of Portland's Grand Glass Atrium Conservatory Heritage Gala, watching my brother Brandon slide a greasy paper tray across the linen tablecloth. It held a cold, soggy turkey sandwich wrapped in cheap plastic, clearly scrounged from the staff break room. Brandon smiled, declaring Noah wasn't included in the premium family package paid for by the corporation. While Brandon's wife Ashley and their children devoured $250 Wagyu beef and summoned the dessert cart, my mother didn't even look up. She simply said I should have packed food for him beforehand. The silence at our table was heavy, thick with the kind of cruelty only blood relatives can perfect. The reason we were even sitting in this multi-million-dollar conservatory tonight was because of Noah. Earlier that afternoon, my son had won the highly competitive Pacific Northwest Young Eco-Innovator Award. He had designed and programmed an exceptionally advanced wetland flood warning sensor. It was a brilliant, functional piece of technology inspired by the genuine, quiet fear of an elderly neighbor whose home was nearly destroyed during last year's severe regional storms. He built it in our garage using spare parts and endless dedication. Brandon's children had also entered the exact same competition. However, they had submitted a massive, overly complex steel bridge model. It was a project entirely constructed and engineered by one of the firm's heavily paid, contracted structural engineers, completely bypassing the spirit of the youth competition. The judges saw right through the expensive facade. Brandon's kids received basic wooden souvenir participation sticks. Noah received the regional trophy and the judge's commendation. To a man like Brandon, a 41-year-old managing director whose entire existence and fragile identity were built on buying external validation and projecting absolute superiority, my son's legitimate, earned success was a massive narcissistic injury. Brandon couldn't stand being outshone, especially by a 12-year-old boy who actually possessed the raw talent and empathy he so desperately lacked. He suffered a deep, silent wound to his ego at the awards ceremony, and he decided to reassert his dominance tonight the only way a coward knew how, through public humiliation disguised as family status and financial hierarchy. I looked down at Noah. My brilliant, empathetic son was quietly taking his beautifully framed award certificate and sliding it beneath the fabric of his chair. He was trying to protect the heavy paper from the cheap grease pooling on his cardboard sandwich tray. He was intentionally shrinking himself, folding his small posture inward, trying to become completely invisible to avoid triggering a grown man's tantrum. I watched my child attempt to minimize his own existence and dull his own light just to keep the fragile, toxic family peace. I didn't cry. I didn't feel a sudden rush of blind panic. I didn't look at my parents and ask myself why my brother was doing this. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I am a senior forensic eco-auditor. My entire professional career is built on dismantling complex corporate structures of deception, finding the hidden financial rot, tracing toxic environmental leaks, and dragging every dirty corporate secret into the harsh fluorescent light. I had been conducting a silent, comprehensive audit on my own family for the past 4 months. I had been gathering hard data, compiling hidden ledgers, mapping out offshore accounts, and preparing for a tactical strike I had desperately hoped I would never actually have to execute. But watching Noah hide his hard-earned achievements behind a cold, soggy sandwich finalized my internal balance sheet. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon a trace of sisterly regret or familial loyalty, but I found absolute emptiness. There was only pure mathematical clarity. The familial contract was officially and irreversibly terminated. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and it was time to aggressively collect on the debt. I immediately signaled a server to order Noah a proper meal on my personal card, but Brandon quickly leaned over and intercepted, waving the staff away with a dismissive, theatrical flick of his wrist. He sighed loudly, leaning back in his expensive chair, and claimed the restaurant staff had already closed the kitchen's event orders for the night. He said it was a logistical error, completely out of his hands, and that we should just be grateful they managed to scrounge up a sandwich from the kitchen so the boy wouldn't starve. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice to defend Noah or demand a new meal from the catering director. I simply reached into my tailored suit pocket, unlocked my phone, and accessed the corporate server. I pulled up the master culinary manifest for the evening's gala. I had securely downloaded the original email confirmation exactly 3 weeks ago, verifying every guest premium selection. The digital footprint on my high-resolution screen showed the venue's manifest had been manually altered at 6 o'clock this morning. Brandon had deliberately logged into the vendor portal using his executive credentials and explicitly canceled Noah's dinner. He had orchestrated this entire pathetic scenario before his morning coffee, calculating the exact logistics required to put a 12-year-old child in his place. When you grow up in a deeply toxic environment, you inevitably fall into the trap of ruthless normalization. Dysfunctional families possess a terrifying, almost mechanical ability to normalize the absolute cruelty of their designated golden child. Brandon's malice was never called what it actually was. It was constantly repackaged, rebranded, and sold by my parents as business assertiveness, corporate leadership, or just a sharp, unapologetic sense of humor. Toxic family systems require everyone else to constantly shrink their boundaries to accommodate the abuser's behavior. They demand that the rest of us absorb the golden child's toxicity to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy, unified family front. I realized then that I had been acting as the silent investor in their twisted version of a family. I had been subsidizing their collective denial with my own endless, uncomplaining endurance. Now, I clearly saw that this family bond had always been a premium subscription service, and I had been the only one footing the heavy emotional bill. I didn't storm out of the conservatory. Running away would only give my brother the satisfaction of an emotional reaction, a victory he desperately craved to soothe his bruised ego. Instead, I stood up slowly and deliberately. I picked up the flimsy paper tray holding the cold sandwich and placed it exactly in the geometric center of the table, perfectly aligned between the towering crystal centerpieces and the $250 Wagyu steaks. I looked straight into my brother's eyes, matching his arrogant stare with pure, unblinking ice. I didn't yell. I simply delivered one word. Noted. I picked up a heavy silver dessert spoon and tapped it sharply against the rim of my crystal water glass. The sharp, high-pitched chime cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the room. One by one, the surrounding tycoon tables ceased their networking. The low hum of wealth, privilege, and corporate chatter evaporated. The entire glass conservatory turned to look at our table. My father, Dad, leaned forward instantly, his face flushing a deep, angry red with sudden embarrassment. He ordered me to sit down immediately, hissing under his breath that I was making a public spectacle and completely ruining the firm's prestigious image in front of our biggest investors. I ignored him completely, my eyes remaining locked on Brandon's narrowing gaze. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the glass atrium swung open with a resounding thud. Samantha Cross, the independent corporate compliance legal counsel, walked into the room. She was an absolute force of nature, radiating uncompromising authority in a sharp black suit. She was flanked by 3 senior board members of Vance Eco Development. Their expressions were universally grim and set in stone. Brandon stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the polished marble floor. He tried desperately to project his usual arrogant authority, laughing nervously and telling the advancing board members that this was just a petty family dispute that had temporarily gotten out of hand. He tried to brush me off as an emotional sister, causing a scene over a mismanaged dinner plate. Samantha did not smile. She did not entertain his desperate attempt at small talk or professional deflection. She walked straight to the center of our table and dropped a thick, heavily bound audit folder onto the pristine linen. She bypassed all pleasantries and initiated the first protocol of our professional escalation. She announced, loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear, that the invoice for this evening's Heritage Gala totaled $39,200. Brandon had fraudulently categorized and charged every single cent of it to the Public Green Development Fund. The bloated invoice included a luxury penthouse suite booked exclusively under his own name for a post-gala celebration. Then Samantha produced the printed email logs. She read his internal communications aloud, presenting undeniable proof that Brandon had explicitly instructed the catering staff to cut a 12-year-old boy's meal in order to, in his exact typed words, save corporate budget. He had literally documented his own cruelty to justify his embezzlement. The silence in the conservatory became suffocating. The wealthy investors and tycoons at the neighboring tables were staring at Brandon, not with their usual amusement or respect, but with absolute unfiltered disgust. He had just been publicly exposed, embezzling tens of thousands of dollars in public development funds while simultaneously denying his own nephew a basic meal to save a fraction of a percent on the bottom line. The carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, untouchable managing director was shattering in real time, right in front of his primary donors. Brandon opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a lie that could spin the unspinable, but I didn't give him the oxygen to speak. I opened my laptop, entered my master decryption key, and turned the high-resolution screen directly toward the board members. I was pivoting this completely from a miserable family dinner into a massive federal-level criminal case. I displayed the hidden cash flow architecture I had uncovered during my months of silent auditing. The forensic ledgers proved Brandon had systematically and illegally wired $1,800,000 to 3 separate offshore shell companies. I presented the incorporation documents alongside the financial transfers. All 3 of these dummy corporations were registered to his former college roommate, a man with zero background in ecological development. I then tossed a stack of gloss-printed surveillance photographs onto the table, letting them scatter right next to my parents' half-eaten Wagyu beef. They were pictures of the shell company's registered addresses. They were empty, abandoned storefronts in a strip mall. There were no vendors, no eco-contractors, no heavy equipment, just empty physical shells built to launder stolen green development funds. But the final, lethal strike was the environmental impact report. To siphon that $1,800,000 without flagging the primary accounting software, Brandon had completely slashed the subsurface waterproofing polymer budget for this exact glass atrium facility. He had authorized the use of highly degraded, substandard materials. I displayed the recent chemical soil analysis on the screen. The toxic chemical runoff from the compromised, cheap foundation had leaked directly into the adjacent heritage wetland ecosystem. It was the exact pristine wetland our late grandfather had painstakingly preserved and left to the family trust. Brandon had literally poisoned his own grandfather's living legacy for cash. Brandon's face contorted into an ugly, desperate mask, his carefully curated image crumbling into pure panic. He slammed his fists on the table, knocking over a crystal wine glass, screaming hysterically that I had orchestrated this entire elaborate corporate audit as petty revenge because of a missing steak. I looked at him with cold, clinical detachment. I informed the board that, effective immediately, I was permanently withdrawing all of my professional forensic engineering certifications from the corporate registry. Without my active credentials, the firm was automatically rendered non-compliant with strict state environmental regulations. I officially and legally nullified 7 active state-funded public development projects across the state of Oregon, projects that Brandon relied on for his annual bonuses. I didn't just expose him, I paralyzed the entire corporation's ability to generate revenue. This wasn't an emotional act of revenge. It was a precise, targeted accounting correction, and the math was entirely undeniable. I still wasn't finished. I pulled up the internal cybersecurity tracking logs and handed the printed copies directly to my 32-year-old brother, Tyler. Tyler was the site lead for the Wetlands Project, the youngest sibling, and the one Brandon constantly manipulated and used as a convenient human shield whenever corporate issues arose. The server logs proved irrefutably that Brandon had spoofed Tyler's IP address, hacking into his administrative account to digitally sign the fraudulent polymer requisitions. Brandon had actively and maliciously framed our youngest brother to take the fall for a massive federal environmental crime. Tyler stared at the technical logs, his face turning a sickly pale before shifting into pure, unadulterated rage. He looked up, his voice shaking with fury, and loudly verified the hack to the board. He officially flipped his allegiance right there at the table, explicitly exposing Brandon's long history of coercion, intimidation, and digital forgery. The board members did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. The chairman announced Brandon's immediate suspension pending a full federal investigation. They ordered him to surrender his corporate phone, his encrypted laptop, and his building access keys immediately. Right there, surrounded by the elite of Portland, Samantha authorized the IT department to freeze all of Brandon's financial access codes and corporate accounts. His access tokens were terminated in real time. Brandon panicked. The arrogant, untouchable facade shattered completely. He grabbed my father's arm, begging him to intervene, demanding they use the powerful Vance family name to settle this internally and quietly. But true power cannot be rented. The illusion of power held by a narcissist is nothing but a leased asset funded by stolen capital and enforced by intimidation. The moment his corporate cards and executive expense accounts were cut off, the entire identity collapses into dust. He was stripped of the company's wealth, and he was nothing but a bankrupt, terrified man wearing an expensive suit he could no longer afford. My mother sat frozen in her chair. Her entire worldview, built on ruthlessly protecting the golden child's perfect image, had just been obliterated by federal fraud and familial betrayal. She looked around the room, shrinking from the piercing, judgmental glares of Portland's elite. The crushing public humiliation was too heavy to bear. Slowly, her hands trembling uncontrollably, she unclasped the solid gold Vance corporate pin from her lapel. She dropped it directly onto Noah's greasy paper sandwich tray. She looked at Brandon, her eyes empty, her voice entirely dead. "We were negligent. You were deliberate." Corporate security stepped forward. They flanked Brandon on both sides and escorted him out of the glass atrium in absolute deafening silence. He walked out completely alone, stripped of everything. Noah and I didn't stay for the dessert service. We left the glittering wreckage of the Heritage Gala behind us, stepping out into the cool night air. We drove to a brightly lit, 24-hour diner across town, miles away from the tycoons and the shattered Vance corporate empire. We sat in a quiet vinyl booth eating warm chocolate chip pancakes and drinking thick milkshakes in absolute beautiful peace. Over the next several months, the accounting settled perfectly. Brandon faced strict federal house arrest, massive civil restitution, and total personal bankruptcy. His wife, Ashley, a woman who valued status and wealth above all else, promptly filed for divorce the moment the bank accounts were frozen. The corporation underwent a massive, painful restructuring under independent federal oversight. The heritage wetland was placed into a rigorous, well-funded ecological recovery program to reverse the chemical damage. In a moment of true justice, Noah's name was officially carved into the new tribute stone at the sanctuary entrance, honoring his early warning sensor that helped mitigate the disaster. Sometime later, my father asked to meet me at a neutral local cafe. He looked aged and completely exhausted. He wanted to discuss a quiet reconciliation, a return to the way things used to be before the audit destroyed his perfect family illusion. I sat across from him, looked at his tired face, and established a boundary forged in solid steel. I politely declined his offer. I refused to ever again trade my dignity and my son's peace for their artificial, hollow version of a family. I walked out of the cafe, stepped into the fresh air, and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation. I've come to realize that holding on to toxic ties out of blind obligation only poisons your own future. When protecting the illusion of a perfect family requires sacrificing the most vulnerable person at the table, you are no longer protecting a family, you are operating a hostage situation. Walking away from blood relatives who view your endurance as a resource to be endlessly harvested isn't a betrayal. It is an act of sovereign self-preservation. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. Real peace doesn't sound like a loud, screaming confrontation. It sounds like one calm, absolute word. Noted? If this story opened your eyes to your own worth and reminded you that your dignity is completely non-negotiable at any table, click the share button, leave your thoughts below, and let me know if you've ever had to say, noted to keep your peace. Let's build a community of people who refuse to stay silent. The toxic cycle ends with you.